conversation. Welcome to all of you, and welcome to all of you who are still joining us and logging in. My name is Matt Reichert. I am the Director of Outreach and Engagement at GIA Publications. We're awfully glad to have you with us for the 7th Homecoming Sunday conversation in our series. I'll let our panelists introduce themselves here in just a minute. Just a couple of real simple instructions and directives. In a moment, we're going to share with you just some basic principles and the outline of what we would like to discuss today, because we know the 500 of you who registered all have questions, and we want to be able to get to as many of them as possible. So we're going to try to anticipate some of those questions as best we can. If you do have a question, please, as best you can, put it in the Q&A box that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. If you click where it says Q&A, you'll be able to add a question there, and it will notify us, and we'll do our best to get to all of the questions we can during this hour. In addition to today's conversation, on Friday, we will be hosting our 8th conversation in the series, our first roundtable discussion, where we're going to try to today unpack the guidelines and principles behind these guidelines. And on Friday, we're going to try to do additional idea sharing and strategizing, especially when it comes to fostering full, conscious, active participation. So that's really sort of a part 2 of this conversation. So if you haven't registered for that conversation on Friday, I encourage you to do so. We will have other resources that we will share with you via a follow-up email to this conversation you will receive from me later tonight or tomorrow morning. This conversation is being recorded and will be rebroadcast tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock Central Time on GIA's Facebook page, and then will be available there for anyone to view at any time. So many of you ask questions about sharing this conversation with your colleagues. You can certainly alert them to that fact, and I'll have the link to that video in the email. So that being said, we're still being joined by others, but we are going to begin the conversation to have as much time as possible. Michael, why don't you introduce yourself, and then after that, maybe Rita and then Rick, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourselves.
Sure, I'm Michael Solhady, Senior Project Editor at GIA. I was a longtime member, active member of the FDLC, Archdiocese of St. Paul, Minneapolis, Region 8, where I got to work with Rita and certainly Msgr Rick in his capacity as head of the Secretariat for Divine Worship and president of NPM. So welcome, friends and colleagues. Rick?
Hey, Monsignor Rick Hilgartner. I'm pastor at St. Joseph Church in Cockeysville, Maryland, Archdiocese of Baltimore. I see a lot of Baltimore participants, some of my brother priests. I believe my music director is 2 doors down from me, Dr. Trapp. Got to give a shout out to Lynn. And as Michael already mentioned, I served for 7 years at the USCCB Secretariat of Divine Worship, and then concurrently, while I was pastor here, served as president of NPM, the National Association of Pastoral Musicians. But I think my role today is more as pastor, but bringing some insight from the national scene. But I'm in the trenches in all of this.
Great. Rita?
Thanks, Rick and Michael and Matt. I'm Rita Thiron. I'm the Executive Director of the Federation of Diocesan Liturgical Commissions. I've held this position for about 6 years. Prior to that, I was in a Diocesan Office of Worship for 20 years. And prior to that, worked in the parish setting. Please don't do the math. Okay. Welcome, everybody.
Wonderful. So what I'm going to do now, for those of you who joined, is I'm going to share a poll with all of you. This poll gives us a sense of who is with us today. So if you would please take a few seconds to answer these questions. We'd like to be able to tailor our conversation to be as practical as possible. So you should see these questions available to you now. I'll give you just a few seconds to answer these questions before we proceed. as you are answering the poll, if you've already answered the poll, again, you can find your copy, your PDF downloadable copy of the FDLC guidelines at the FDLC website, that is fdlc.org. In a moment, I'll give you the general structure and outline of our conversation together, but our goal really is to walk through the structure of the guidelines as best as we can in the time we have available. So if you've already voted responded to the poll, I say voted, vote early, vote often as a Chicago-based company. If you've already responded to the poll, if you would please make sure you have those guidelines downloaded. I'll leave the poll up for about 25 more seconds here, and then I can share with you our responses.
I will say here, the link on the FDLC website is when you go to the homepage, you just follow the link to liturgical resources during the pandemic, which is right there below the banner. And reopening resources is the name of the document, correct?
Yes, simply fdlc.org/COVID will get you there.
Perfect. Just a few more seconds. We are at 80% of those of you with us have responded. Thank you. All right, I am going to end the poll. We've got a pretty good sample size of who is with us, and I'm going to share the results. So you should be able to see the results of who is with us. By far, 55% of those of you who have responded are music ministers. Other major groups represented, of course, are pastoral staffs, parish worship commission, pastors. We're seeing that about half of you are live streaming weekend liturgies or so. About 16% of you are not offering live streamed liturgies currently. About 74% of you who are live streaming have fewer than 10 who are present for those live streams. Only 2% of those of you who have responded are currently open for public worship, and almost 70% still have no determination of when your parish churches might reopen. And then again, given social distancing guidelines, about 60% of you or so estimate the new capacity of your church will be at about 25%. Almost 70% will be at 25% or less. So thank you again, those of you who have responded to the poll. It gives us a good sense of where we're at and how those realities will shape our conversation. So I am going to now share the outline for what we hope to be able to accomplish today. You should now all see the outline for today's conversation. We're going to speak, generally about diocesan and civil guidelines, the general principles that go into shaping these guidelines. We'll certainly talk about safety measures along with compliance with social distancing. And then we'll really get into the practicals of best practices for that first Sunday back. Certainly music ministry, which hopefully will address the majority of the group, or those of you who are music ministers. And then also talking about impact on various parts of the Mass, reception of Holy Communion, etc. So that's the overall structure for today's conversation. So let's jump in right away here, Rita, with this list of general principles. If you'd talk us through this list and the way that they inform these FDLC guidelines.
Well, certainly the FDLC guidelines are just that, they're guidelines. And we know that the important guideline for you is the guideline put out by your individual bishop as head of his local church and the chief liturgist of your diocese. So while many of you still don't know when you're going to open again, I'm glad that you're all participating in this webinar so that you can make a plan. And that's exactly what's been happening at the diocesan level. Your bishop and his liturgical commission and his other consultants have been developing a plan. So when we put together this plan in conversation with our members and others, so with some medical people, we established these very simple priorities, general principles of how we were going to attack this, writing this guideline, and how we would bring forth these principles as principles that probably we should all be aware of. First of all, the common good is our priority. Our first consideration must be the health and safety of parishioners and those whom they encounter. Even in canon law, it talks about the role of the bishop protecting the common good, and it talks about the duty of the faithful to protect the common good. This is especially true when we have vulnerable members of our community, those who have been identified as 65 or older, or who have recurring health issues that are particularly vulnerable. So let's admit to ourselves that the common good is going to be our priority in all of this and in every decision we make. Second of all, we suggested that we define policies in phases, much like the civil government is doing. There have benchmarks that they will, they're not going to just open things all at once. We're going to use benchmarks of, how many cases of COVID-19 are in the area, what's the capacity of hospitals, what dates made this change. And so it makes very clear that each principle in the guideline is temporary or maybe long-term. Especially when that comes to liturgical practices that we may have to abandon for a while, and for the sake of the common good, we'll define policies in phases. We suggest that we continue to offer televised masses, and most of the diocesan guidelines that I've seen come out are anxious to do this. They know that they have populations that may require that let's acknowledge the fear and the very real anxiety that's out there regarding this pandemic, and the advice of medical personnel that people may not feel comfortable for a while returning to our houses of worship. So we will continue to offer televised masses and continue to offer outreach to our people in that way. We suggested in our guidelines that the extension for the dispensation from the Sunday obligation continue for a while. In the diocesan guidelines that I've seen so far, every single bishop has extended that, again, in deference to the people in the population that would be at high risk for contracting the virus. And so bishops have been very generous in extending the dispensation from the Sunday obligation. Our other principle was that we wanted to preserve the liturgical year. You may recall that when the Congregation for Divine Worship and Discipline in the Sacraments at the Vatican was going to talk about Holy Week and the Sacred Paschal Triduum, right away they said Easter is not going to be postponed. There's a season before it, there's a season after it. It's a hinge thing in our entire liturgical year. And so they said, no, Easter will be on the date of Easter and we will celebrate accordingly. That's true for us now. We will preserve our liturgical year. We will maintain the primacy of Sunday especially. So our mass texts and so forth will reflect that. We suggest that communication is key. Many times, as you know, diocesan guidelines first go out to the priests and the pastoral staff, and that has to be communicated to the people. Every change we make, every new procedure we implement has to respect them as members of the assembly. So many of you are doing a terrific job of that on your websites, on Facebook pages, etc., that you're communicating with your people and keeping them informed of mass times, of what's happening with weddings and funerals, keeping the community going, especially charitable outreach that you've all been doing. So thank you for that. But especially when we begin to reopen churches, people need to be told what they will encounter when they first walked in. As the Detroit Archdiocesan Guideline quite clearly said, even today, Mass will not look the same as it did 2 months ago. So we need to respect that, and we need to communicate at all levels in all methodologies, whether it be a direct mailing or a website posting or a video from the pastor or the bishop. Communication will be key, and multiple levels of communication, multiple times. And finally, we ask you to think long-term. Many of you have already indicated you don't know when your parish will be reopening. That's good. You're consulting with civil authorities. And so we need to think long-term on this. There could be a recurrence of an upswing of the virus. So we want to plan for that. We want to know what to do in case we have to reimpose guidelines, so to speak. So let's all think long-term. So is that a good way for us?
No, I think that sounds wonderful, and I'll be putting that screen back up again, so you'll be able to see it. Those of you who are participating. One of the things that I should mention too is using that list of guidelines. We're going to do our best to talk about real practical responses to your questions. We don't necessarily know the specific answer to suit everyone's particular experience, because of every parish is different in diocese and state, etc. But we're going to couch our responses back to those guidelines. If nothing else, we hope to be able to equip all of you with a way to think about your question through the lens of those guidelines to then come up with an answer. So maybe a way to pivot to our next topic, Rita, is that second to last bullet point, communication is key. So let me give you an example from my parish, because I know my pastor is not listening. In my parish, our churches are not open for masses, but they are open for people to come and pray. And in the messaging that was sent out, it clearly says that the pew must be sanitized before and after someone comes to pray. But it doesn't mention how or by whom, or if cleaning products are made available, or if I need to bring them. And I use it as an example, both to emphasize communication is key, and all of us have been thinking about these things for so long. Of course, we fill in blanks without thinking about it, but many of the people that we are now communicating to have not been thinking about this to the same degree that we have. So we really have to be very specific, especially when it comes to safety and hygiene. So maybe we could pivot to these questions about the worship space and the recommendations and guidelines given about safety and hygiene, both how we keep the worship space clean, but also duty of individuals.
I agree. I think we always have to have a plan. I attended a FEMA webinar, and the most impressive person was a Baptist minister who also happened to be an MD, and she had plans. Actually, it was for the wasn't Baptist, it was AME, and she had plans of what supplies are on hand, who does what, and so forth. So it's important for each parish to have a plan and to communicate it either to volunteers or to staff.
Yeah.
Rick, you want to go on with the worship space and some of the things we've...
Sure. I would just point out from the liturgical world, just like the rubrics of things like the Missal and the other liturgical books speak in a broad context, they can't speak to the specifics of every worship space. So there are lots of things, when you read the general instruction of the Roman Missal, you read the rubrics of the Order of Mass, there are lots of things that aren't specific because you don't know how big is the space, how is it arranged, and there's a wide range of experiences. And I think the same goes for things like this. I see a question about working in air filtration and air conditioning systems. Our diocese yesterday sent out some more specific guidelines and suggestions from our Office of Risk Management, talking about maintenance of air conditioning systems and just ventilation. It's clear what we're hearing nationally, that circulating air and fresh air and open spaces are better than confined spaces on a lot of ways. And so again, some churches are going to be big and spacious with lots of room for fresh air. Climates will be different. Churches that are in areas where the air conditioning has to be going might allow for some great filtration, but it means the building might be more sealed. Same with just preparing spacing, and how new or how old a church is will determine how much leg room there is, or to use the airline industry term, seat pitch. You know, the older churches are more like economy class, and newer churches might be, you know, follow more up-to-date building codes that allow for more room, that you might be able to have you know, just one empty pew in between. So we're being told to go through and figure out how much space we need to allow for, mark off pews with tape, with painter's tape, maybe even mark off aisles for communion processions. And I think generally a plan for sanitizing on a regular basis. It's one thing to, you know, have a church that's been closed to say, go through, we're going to do a deep sanitize and use some really good professional cleaning products. But that's only good to get you to day one. You know, what happens between masses? There are many who are saying our guidelines for Baltimore speak to having to do some sanitizing in between every mass when we get to that point. And we might adjust our mass schedules to allow for a cleaning team, volunteers after each mass who'd stay around and use disposable sanitizer wipes or spray bottles and rags to go through and wipe the tops of the pews. You know, do you need to wipe off doors, or can you leave doors propped open so that people don't have to touch door handles or door pushes or pulls? How can you minimize the physical contact in some things? And so we've talked about, there's a lot of places have already talked about removing hymnals and any kind of paper handouts that would be passing from one person to the next. So a lot of this will have to do with what facilities you have, how much they're being used on a daily basis, on an hourly basis when we get to Sundays. And I think look to your dioceses, especially when it comes to facilities. Your Office of Facilities or Risk Management might have the resources to connect you to locally for HVAC maintenance. And it might just be a question of making sure that filters are cleaned and you've got fresh air filters in. And maybe it's a possibility of being able to upgrade filters to something that's more sophisticated. You know, we obviously aren't in the same place that hospitals are, but you know, they're public spaces, and there's more and more being said that churches are particularly susceptible because you've got a lot of people in close proximity.
Yeah.
Who are accustomed to being in close contact and having personal contact.
And let's not forget washing other things like the ambo that multiple people may touch, vessels, vestments, including servers' elbs. All of those things need to be cleaned on a far more regular basis. The CDC guidelines were going to be very particular about how to clean and with what to clean. I understand that the draft went to the White House last week, and then it was thought to be too prescriptive, so they were rewriting it. So let's have a look out for the revised CDC guidelines, and it will give us more medical ideas of how to clean things.
And Michael, in a second, it'd be great if we could have you talk a little bit about your parish experience just with removing hymnals and some of the things that you, because I know your community is strategizing, so you're removing them. How do you do that? But also, how do you use it? But one quick thing, both from what you just mentioned, Rick and Rita, I think it's important for people to think about, you know, applying that principle about thinking longer term. I think we can come up with a plan for how to sanitize, how to wash our hands, how to use hand sanitizer, how to get whatever, accustomed to the immediacy of products being available. But we also have to think longer term that as we're coming with our policy, we have to be asking ourselves the real question of, can we get 10 gallons of hand sanitizer every weekend? You know, can we, 2 months from now, will we be able to get that disinfectant? And so I think that's an important thing to remind people. And then just to reemphasize what you were saying, that if you're developing a plan and you don't understand how your church's airflow or HVAC system works, that's going to be a problem. Like, you really need to just know the basic function of how your building works in order to address that common good. But to that question of disinfecting and safety, if you are looking at the FDLC guideline document, we are on page 6 under safety and hygiene in worship spaces. Michael, do you want to talk a little bit about how your community is thinking around, again, removing hymnals or worship resources, but still using those worship resources?
Yeah, it's ironically this very morning we had some folks boxing up our hymnals, And we're going to just keep them kind of in the gathering space. We don't want them to look like they're lost or gone, but just a little visual reminder there. It's also interesting, we're continuing to watch all of this information from other disciplines come forward. And there have been some articles going around from like the National Association of Libraries, how they're handling books. And they're thinking that maybe 48, 72 hours may be enough for a virus to dissipate from a book. And I suppose if one is in a tiny church, and I'm not a medical person here, or if you have one mass on a weekend only, maybe those hymnals can stay if there's only one person touching them each Sunday. I don't know. There are concerns about how does one receive a worship aid when one enters? Does one take one itself? Is it disposed of afterwards? I know we'll talk about music a little bit later, and I'm betting at some point in the future we might have an entire show devoted to how to sing and what we can do. But we've boxed up our hymnals. We're trying to, we'll encourage people to take a hymnal home for use and even have that hymnal with them as they're singing at home. Also encouraging people to get a hymnal for their app or a missalette for home use, but we're trying to find ways to respectfully put them away, but also keep them present in people's hands. And we'll be later today talking about here some possible ways of singing. So,
yeah. And we'll, in the email that I will send to all participants who registered, in addition to the links to the documents we're describing, I'll send the link to that, the article Michael mentioned from the Library of Congress, because, you know, it occurs to me what you were saying before, Rita, about all of the things that we use in touch, from vestments to microphones to ambos, everything that needs to be sanitized. Of course, that also means, you know, our lectionaries, and that means the missals, and we have to be careful. We have to sanitize them. We also have to be careful so that we're careful with them, you know, and we're being safe, but we're also not putting caustic solutions on these pages for these very expensive resources. Although I'm sure those who sell missals are happy to sell us another, but we need to be careful about the way that we clean those also.
Great.
Go ahead,
hygiene
please.
in our worship space extends to us. We need to show up to Mass with hands washed and hand sanitizers in our purses or pockets, and if they're not put at the doors of the church, our own face masks need to be worn, and of course, the big one, if you're sick, stay home.
Yeah, right, exactly. And I think, you know, that's a good transition point too. And we can obviously continue to talk about these safety hygiene questions. And I know we're getting questions in Q&A, but one of the other big components of these guidelines are recommendations around how to maintain social distancing practices. So not only how are we encouraging people to sanitize their hands as they enter this worship space, but also once we're in the worship space, what do we do? So I want to switch screens here back to our slides. And then I want to pivot, if we could, to this slide with social distancing recommendations. Rita, I'm wondering if you would talk us through this. If you are watching or participating along with the guidelines, these are on page 7.
So it's obvious that we need to, in all areas of life, maintain social distancing. The CDC is recommending at least 6 feet distance. I go out for a walk and I run to the other side of the sidewalk if I'm passing someone else on the street. And I think everybody's being very careful and respectful of that. We have to maintain these social distancing either before, during, and after the liturgy as well. So it's going to take some math. We have to measure the capacity of our church. How many pews will be left in between pews? What sections of the church are we going to use? Most guidelines now are saying you're going to only have 25% of the capacity you used to have. And map it out, use ribbons or tape or something that just politely says to people, we're not going to use this pew today. Obviously, household units, mom and dad and the little kids come in, they can still sit together. But there needs to be 6 feet in all directions to distance the assembly apart. I would apply these not only to chapels and other meeting spaces in your campus, parish campus, but I would also close rooms that make distancing impossible. I would close anybody that still has a cry room in their parish, just lock it and just put a sign on the door saying, we won't be using this for a while. You're going to have to train ushers and greeters to helpfully, cheerfully welcome and explain to people what's going on. And it'll take a couple weeks. Again, prior to communication to all members of the parish will help minimize any confusion that first or second week. And just explain to the ushers how this is going to happen and welcome them at the door of the church and walk. This may mean you may need more ushers. You may need extra spaces, live streaming to the school gym or something, or to the parish hall. Most people are looking at how to welcome people to a specific mass. Most diocesan guidelines have been recommending some kind of reservation system or online ticketing like Eventbrite or EventBee, or what's the one for group responses just on your parish website. Think about how you might want to do that and be specific, saying this is for the 9:00 a.m. on, May 10th or something. So be a specific mass so people don't be confused, or on Saturday vigil mass. If possible, add extra masses. Some poor priests are trying to cover 4 parishes already. Or you may have a priest that is living in your parish, but maybe of an age that he can't do multiple masses. So if possible, add extra masses, or as Rick said earlier, space them out a little more. Always communicate to the parishioners ahead of time about how they are to enter as well as how they are to leave. You may want to limit the entrance to one door if possible. You can't lock any doors, that's fire hazard, but limit the entrance to one propped open door. But when they're leaving, open all the doors so people can disperse more quickly. We don't want them to feel like they are confined to pass the hour-long mass. And even when you're doing, maybe in the fall, confirmations, first communions, and so forth, communicate how those may have to be done in smaller groups.
Yeah. Monsignor, what's happening in your parish when it comes to social distancing? How are you thinking through guidelines like this?
We're definitely we're already mapping out space. Haven't addressed the access and ticketing issue, but what I could say, I am hearing from people in other dioceses is that everybody's approaching this, and even the name of this workshop is Homecoming Sunday, and that we're all treating this, and it would be great if we'd have this kind of eagerness and passion and hunger for the Eucharist to get back. But what dioceses that are open are already reporting is that they're planning for this possibility of a surge in capacity or a surge in attendance. But there are so many people who are simply apprehensive because there are so many restrictions in place. People are reading some of this as it must not be safe yet, and that there are so many unanswered questions. There's still so much we don't know, and I don't want to be the fearmonger here, but I think we need to be prepared for the possibility that we might have crowds, and we want to accommodate people. But at the same time, they're looking at so many questions of people who are experiencing any symptoms should stay home. People who are at increased risk or have a series of comorbid symptoms or conditions, there are going to be enough people, people in a lot of retirement communities that are still quarantined. We have a number of parishioners living in one of those huge lifetime care places, independent apartments, but they're on a lockdown. So we have people who won't be able to come to Mass because they're experiencing other restrictions. So I think I'm calmed a little bit by hearing about what some dioceses that have started opening aren't seeing surges of thousands of people trying to get into church and having to turn hundreds of people away. That some places aren't even hitting their reduced capacity. You know, they'd say, you know, full capacity is 1,200, our reduced capacity is 400. We had 200. So that the problem might not be as much of a crisis as we might want it to be. And I think there's going to be a very gradual ramp up.
Yeah. I mean, I think this underscores obviously back to the beginning in that first slide, the need for parishes already live streaming or televising liturgies to continue to do so, especially with the reduced capacity. I think, you know, emphasizing that general principle of communication is helpful to me, quite frankly, as an individual. It's hard for me to consider how would I do in my parish a ticketing system, a reservation system that didn't seem like it had unintended messaging, you know, right? However, at the same time, I also realize the value in communication of knowing who is going to be coming to that 9 o'clock liturgy, to be able to follow up with them ahead of time with instructions or information. There's a parish, and I apologize, I forget the name, I think it's the St. Thomas in College Park, Texas, that they put together a video for their parishioners, the do's and don'ts of how to come back into the church. And it's an easy thing, so they don't have to keep announcing it. But I mean, we're gonna have to continue to communicate all those messages. I wonder, linking social distancing along with safety, hygiene, and worship space, maybe this is an appropriate time also to talk about recommendations around masks. I know there are a lot of people who are asking questions. Do you encourage people coming to Mass to wear a mask in the church or not? So maybe let's start with congregation first, and then we can consider others. I mean, how do we think around that issue or that requirement?
Well, the CDC has already come out and mentioned masks for everybody. Going to the store, we're going to be wearing masks.
I think that'll be a state guideline too.
Yeah,
I mean, right now we have being in public places in Maryland, masks are required. Even the grocery store, public transportation, and so that's going to be a guideline. That question will answer itself. Yeah.
So then let me add to that one. I got several of you sent questions in ahead of time. Thank you. We're going to try to address all of those. A question from Cincinnati, from a pastor in Cincinnati, who asks, what about me as a presider? Do I wear a mask or not? Because of course there are different sources of information, different guidelines by diocese, FDLC, other groups, and everyone kind of has a different way of wording presiders and masks. So I mean, maybe Monsignor Rick, how do we think about this, especially for presiders?
Sure. There are a couple of things. One is there's the state law, or whatever the state policy is going to be, and hopefully diocesan guidelines would harmonize with that rather than try to defy it. You know, respecting the civil law and the common good there. Some of it comes down to functionality too. I think for me as a priest, if I'm expecting the assembly to be masked, for most of the Mass, I mean, they have to remove their mask to receive communion, obviously, then I would do the same thing in terms of while I'm seated and not functioning or before the Mass begins, I would be masked, and I would remove the mask when I'm speaking. So when I'm at the presider's chair leading prayer, certainly at the altar during the Eucharistic prayer, preaching, those kinds of things, moments when I need to be effectively communicating, the mask is going to prevent that. And we see that happen at every level. I see a lot of the press conferences with government leaders, and our governor has been very conscientious about that, being pictured with a mask on, removes it when he comes to the microphone to speak. So I think that should be the case for all the liturgical ministers. The lector would be masked. They come up to the ambo, lower their mask to proclaim the readings, and then go back to their place and put their mask on. I think that's just going to be recognizing who we are as part of the assembly, that we don't stand apart, even though we might be more physically distant from others. And then I think that would be for all liturgical ministers. Some dioceses already have guidelines about whether or not we even need or should be using altar servers at this point, because there would normally for servers be a lot of close proximity, but is there a way for the presider to have a book stand rather than have a server standing in front of him in a way that would be somewhat threatening? If the priest unmasked is standing there right in front of a server speaking in close proximity, there's great danger there, or great risk, or increased risk at least. So thinking about, do you need servers? Well, maybe we can do without it. You have a credence table right near the altar, and make use of it that way. Here at my parish, we have a seminarian in residence, so we're already sharing the same house. It's like we're family members. So we don't have to worry about the social distancing quite as much because we live in the same house and we're at the kitchen table and the dinner table. So I'll have the seminarian serving more often because he can stand closer.
Yeah.
And you will also want to look at the presider's proximity to the vessels.
Yes, during the Eucharistic prayer, having to make sure Ciboria are sufficiently distant, maybe have corporals off to the side that aren't in the range of my breath and particles and all of that, even in normal speaking tones.
Oh, go ahead, Michael.
I was just going to maybe try to work on a little bit of music here, because there's a little bit of connection here also. People are wondering about singing, and sure, some directives or some studies have gone out. There's one that came out this morning from the CDC that at least I saw. And yeah, we're still not totally sure what this means. There's different types of singing. There's full-throated choral singing or solo singing. What is it like to sing with the mask on? What's the difference between glory to God and glory to God? Kind of half singing. Can we hum? Can we ooh? So we're seeing dioceses say no singing at all. We just don't fully understand yet. And I think it's fair to say a bunch of folks in a choir loft, that's not going to happen. A tightly formed ensemble, that shouldn't happen. But we still need a little time to figure out what we can do. And if I can just say one or two more things about music. This might be a time when our opening hymns or opening songs need to be left away, put away, and we have instrumental music. Could we sing shorter songs? But once again, a lot of questions are about singing. Have to be careful with it, but I don't think there's a definitive answer, and there's different types of singing and expelling.
Yeah, at my parish, we're looking at using short antiphons that would be sung less robustly than a big hymn with gusto. We'll look at paring back some of the music where, we might look at not singing the Gloria, maybe not singing a closing hymn. That was, somebody had a question and observation about that there isn't a prescription for a closing hymn. That's kind of, that's an addition to the liturgy. The rubrics say nothing about singing at the conclusion of the Mass. So we might look at paring that back, maybe at offertory, at the presentation of gifts, just having instrumental music. So ways to minimize it, and then choose settings that are shorter, less robust. This is a GIA-sponsored workshop, so we'll certainly talk about Taizé as an appropriate way that's more meditative and requires perhaps more of the humming, where people can just kind of quietly sing along and sing from behind the mask and still feel like you're participating. We're going to have to, as liturgical ministers, get used to the sound of an assembly that's going to be less robust. People sitting more spaced out, smaller assemblies. And if people are fearful of singing, they might even be fearful of just speaking loudly and giving their responses and engagement in that active participation that may start to look and feel and sound quite different.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I want to, sorry, Rita, real quickly. I mean, we can keep, let's continue to talk about these questions about liturgical ministry, because obviously there are a lot of questions that have been submitted, and this is a topic that we need to explore. Just really quickly, I want to remind everyone again that our next conversation in this series on Friday, 2:00 Eastern, that you can register for, we'll be exploring this concept of how do we encourage full, conscious, active participation given all of these questions. So I don't want to not talk about those things right now, but also know that if we don't get to fully explore things like no singing doesn't necessarily mean no music, or what do you do to help support people's prayer at home? Some of those things will be part of our conversation on Friday. So just as a reminder, if we don't get to it today, we have another conversation scheduled. In terms of the rest of our liturgical ministries here, certainly sticking with music ministry and how we approach that concept, but also ushers, greeters, electors. Anything else that we want to add here right now, Rick or Rita, before we start thinking about parts of the Mass?
I want to come back to the lector question. There are a lot of places that we've talked about sanitizing and, sanitizing all spaces and things that can be touched. So even like wiping down the lectionary, the book of the Gospels, and maybe even limiting the use of some of those things. Is there a way, not liturgically ideal, we might have to put aside some of our liturgical values for the sake of the common good and health, to simplify, maybe use a single lector rather than two readers, to minimize the number of people at the ambo. The question of sanitizing the microphone, I think it's a question of simply reminding people that they don't need to be right on top of it. One person speaks at the microphone, another person's going to come up later if it's the lector, followed by the presider, or even a deacon reading the gospel and then the presider. Suggesting that the sound, that they need to keep their distance from the microphone. And it's not as though the next person's going to come up and put their mouth on the microphone. So, the windshield for the microphone it might be catching things, but we're not generally handling it and grabbing it. So it's something that's generally not touched. But I think there are ways to look at, and if attendance at Mass is down, we need fewer extraordinary ministers. A communion from the chalice is certainly off the table for the time being. We're looking at shifting some of our Eucharistic ministers to be post-Mass sanitizing crews, because we've got a whole cadre of Eucharistic ministers that we won't be scheduling. And we're going to try and say, hey, would some of you be willing to be scheduled after a Mass to stick around and wipe down the pews? On a Sunday, after the Mass that you normally attend, and instead of assisting with communion, assisting with this as another ministry to the assembly.
Well, that just goes to show all the training that we have to do to all of our liturgical ministers. We need their leadership. We need them to model good practices and not get upset about things, and just model that this is how we're going to have to do things for a while. I see many comments on the screen regarding the projection of singing. Again, that deserves another webinar or two. And we want in all of these things to be cognizant of the medical experts, and the medical experts are talking about aerosol and the projection of germs and so forth. So we need to just be cognizant and continue to look for best medical advice on this matter.
Yeah. A couple of quick things, and then we of course only have about 11 minutes left. I'm going to be brash here and say we'll take a few questions after the hour. We can't extend it too much, but we'll do our best to add a little bit more time here to pick up some speed. I do want to say, first of all, there are lots of ideas that you're sharing with one another in the chat feature. We do have the ability to archive that and share those ideas when we do our follow-up. So I want to just make sure that as you're seeing these ideas coming forward, we do have a way to capture that. Also, we're going to talk about this on Friday, sort of, again, best practices for live stream liturgies, again, encouraging full conscious active participation. And let me be careful here, so clear here, if there is a safe way to do it, right? So right there, if there is a safe way to do it and you have the procedure in place, from a parent's perspective of 4 young children watching live stream liturgy at home, it is so helpful to be able to see other members of our community where they're able to minister safely in that live stream liturgy. So it's not just my pastor, it's not just the same people. There's a different sense. We communicate something differently about how we're even interacting with that live stream liturgy when there is the ability to have a lector, or there is the ability to have, again, if done safely. So we'll explore more of those best practices and principles on Friday, but I just want to add that there's another dimension here as we think about how we do things safely. How is this intersecting with the rest of our congregation who is watching at home or praying at home, that we consider? As we transition to think about different parts of the liturgy, let's jump to the big one, if we could, and talk about the distribution of Holy Communion. lots of questions from people about how do I do this? How do I think about this? How do we think about the communion rite? So for those of you who have downloaded the guide, there's a variety of things that we can point to here, but in particular, we're looking at page 10, the communion rite under the heading liturgical considerations. So let's jump in here again, using these guidelines and principles, figuring out what to do for our communities. What are the things we want to make sure to consider as we make our own decisions here?
Well, certainly the whole notion of procession has to be part of this. And our processions in the introductory rite and the concluding rite will have to be different. They probably will come from the sacristy and not walking through the people. So that impacts how we do a procession, all the other processions of the Mass, the presentation of the gifts. So again, we'll probably be coming from the credence table and not coming up the aisle from a family. For a while. Then the communion procession itself will have to be distanced. As Rick has mentioned, the markers on the pew, there's some tape on the floor, how to be distant in our procession towards Holy Communion. We may want to consider additional Eucharistic ministers so that the stations themselves are spread further apart. And again, your bishop will determine guidelines on the distribution of Holy Communion. But certainly, and the general instruction and canon law give them permission to do so. We gave you a handout today with everything, not everything, but some major points of the authority of the bishop on the distribution of Holy Communion. Certainly, as Rick has mentioned, we will not be using for a while the distribution of the precious blood to the faithful and a shared chalice. So that's a given, and I haven't seen any diocesan guideline contradicting that so far. The FDLC guidelines suggest communion in the hand, only because saliva is one of the primary transmissions of this disease, or the most receptive to the virus entering the body. We've been told to keep our hands away from our mouth and our noses to keep the virus from entering there. Certainly the use of masks, we'll talk about that. Some diocesan guidelines are permitting the distribution of Holy Communion on the tongue, but they're doing so with some cautions, including that the minister must use hand sanitizer in between. I would caution that the hand sanitizer needs time to be effective. It can't be every 10 seconds, go to the next person. Some diocesan guidelines have also suggested that there be a separate line for those who wish to receive Holy Communion on the tongue, or perhaps that they are last in the procession. Again, the thing we have to remember in all of our choices is the common good. Canon law itself stresses that. Rick, would you care to comment?
Well, yeah, that this is going to be a sensitive question, and it gets into people's own devotion, and different dioceses are answering the question in different ways. Some bishops have written very, very good commentaries on the urgency of and the charity that it shows to put aside one's own personal preference for receiving on the tongue. Not to mention the liturgical catechesis, quoting Cyril of Jerusalem and the mystagogical catecheses. So there's a lot there. Our diocese has a requirement that there has to be a small table in front of the priest, so that actually helps make a little bit of physical distance. And that table would have hand sanitizer on it, so that if, as the communion minister, I happen to brush against the hand of the communicant, or someone receives on the tongue and I feel like I've been contaminated, I have a place to put the ciborium down, use hand sanitizer, and there'll be a purificator there as well. And then I can pick up and resume communion for the next person. So there's questions about gloves in the distribution of communion. The challenge for wearing gloves is that, as the guidelines say, in order for the gloves to be effective, you'd have to change the gloves throughout communion, because once they're contaminated by one person, then the glove is no good. It's defeated the purpose of wearing the gloves. So not exactly, you don't think of it quite that way, but suddenly, yeah, once the glove is contaminated, then it's no better than a bare hand.
Yeah, and that also goes back to, again, whether we're talking about distribution of Holy Communion, we're talking about hospitality, whatever we're talking about, the procedures we build, back to that final principle from that first slide of thinking long-term, we have to be able to make sure that we have a guarantee that we can get that hand sanitizer and we can get those gloves and we can get all of those things for the longer term. There's a question that has come up in the chat and in the Q&A about instead of having communion procession, of having Holy Communion be distributed with everyone remaining in place. And I'm not sure what we're seeing in other guidelines or what we're seeing in terms of other directives or people's conversation about this suggestion or this question.
I think that's another local use kind of question about how easy is it for the priest or the other minister to move about that way. And that might be a viable solution. The challenge is the priest can't, if the priest needs to have some hand sanitizer with him,
right,
how's he going to do that while he's walking around, where having a specific spot where I can put the paten or ciborium down and have the hand sanitizer there and then pick it back up again. But there is the challenge of social distancing, of physical distancing in a communion procession.
Yeah, right, exactly. So we are almost to the hour, but we're going to go a few minutes longer, if that's okay. And I understand some of you who are joining us will need to leave. Again, just a quick reminder before our final portion of the conversation here that we are recording this and this will be made available to, and you will get a link to that recording in the follow-up email that I will send to you later tonight or tomorrow morning. We could have 10 more conversations like this and we could still not get to all of the questions, of course, especially with almost 70% of you saying, you don't have a time set yet for resumption of public worship. It's indicative of so many questions and so many things that need to yet be put into place. So as we think about our final topic here for the four of us, as people are leaving this conversation, knowing the majority of people who are joining us still don't have that quote unquote homecoming Sunday date set yet. What are the thoughts that we wish to leave people with? What are the next steps? What are the next things we need to be thinking about? We need to start to put into place as we begin to prepare.
I think two things. One is recognizing that for some time, there will continue to be people who are not able to be with us, who will be afraid to join us. And we need to recognize that even as we reopen the doors, there will be plenty of people that we need to continue to minister to at home. And so what we're doing virtually has to continue for quite some time. I'm realizing that we're also reaching homebound parishioners who've been homebound and who will continue to be homebound even after normalcy comes back, however far off that is, that we found a new success in reaching homebound parishioners because we're working harder at it, and we're not going to be able to just turn that off and say, okay, we've hit the final phase, we're back to normal, there's a vaccine, so we go back to normal life, and then kind of forget about the sick and homebound. So that's one piece. The other piece is that there is going to be more than one correct answer for all of this. And we're already seeing different dioceses are having different guidelines and they're making some different choices, some different priorities. And we shouldn't be so quick to say that one answer is right and the other one's wrong. As Michael alluded to earlier, there are a lot of things we don't know. I've seen lots of questions in the Q&A about how the virus lives and different kinds of surfaces. We're not here to talk about the science of that because that's not our thing. And there are a lot of things we still don't know about this virus, about the disease. So as we learn more, we're going to have to be flexible, but I think we also have to be respectful of what one place chooses to enact as their best choice or their best decision. Another community might choose something different.
I guess the principle I'd like to leave everybody with is Augustine's, and that is in all things charity. We've seen liturgical wars already breaking out. We all are hungering for the Eucharist. We all are hungering for community. We all know the value of liturgy and its ability to transform us, whether we're in the front pew or 6 feet back, or watching at home. We're all in this together. We're all in this as a country and as a world. If Pope Francis has taught us nothing else, it's that we have to be charitable towards one another and seek the guidance of God in all of this. So thank you, everybody, for even being here today. That shows me your great devotion to the liturgy and your great urgency in trying to make this work for everybody. So thank you.
Michael, do you have a final takeaway that, I mean, both not only someone who works in this industry, but also as a parish pastoral minister? I mean, what are your takeaways here?
Well, I want to say this. Most of my time today was spent trying to keep up with literally the hundreds of questions, and we have never had a session like this. So my job was to try to just interact with people. Please, if you haven't, get the FDLC guidelines, and so much of what we would have liked to have gotten to is there. So these things have been answered via this document. And just to repeat that this has to be diocese by diocese, and we need to be comfortable with that. And I know we've been at this for 8 weeks, the pandemic, but we're only beginning. We're at the very beginning of this return to worship. So information is coming fast and furious, and we just need to give ourselves permission to try and talk and maybe err, but err on the side of cautious and err on the side of charity. And as Rita said, so good luck, folks.
Yeah. If there's been one commonality through the 7 conversations we've had so far, it's the emphasis on the fact that none of us have ever been through anything like this before. And I think that's not, it's just a reality. And so the fact, you know, to your points, Rita, that with all things charity, with all things hope, with all things confidence, I mean, certainly we're going to find our way through. Thank you to all of you who joined, again, to echo Rita's sentiments. I mean, we know you're taking the time to be here because you're interested, but also you are determined to do right by your communities, to minister well, to minister safely, and we appreciate that very much. We will receive follow-up email with other links and things. If there are other things you know we, GIA, the FDLC, other organizations can do to help, questions that you have, conversations to host, please, please, please let us know. We are trying to do the best we can to match need and resource. So whatever you can do, you can feel free to email me. You can feel free to email any of us and reply. So thank you again. God bless you all. Please continue to stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you in another Homecoming Sunday conversation. Have a wonderful day.